Welcome to my channel. My name is Mark Castro. I'm a licensed real estate broker in the state of California. I've also been practicing property management for over 24 years now. Today's video is in reference to the State of California Department of Consumer Affairs Tenant Landlord Handbook. Now, before we proceed, I must disclose that YouTube is very particular about copyright material, and rightfully so, of course. So, the first piece of disclosure is I did not compose any of this material. This is all public record. This handbook that we're looking at here, or the one that we're reviewing right here, is a handbook that was drafted by or composed by the State of California Department of Consumer Affairs, and we can see that here. And the title of the handbook is California Tenants, a Guide to Residential Tenants and Landlords' Rights and Responsibilities. And we see that here. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment down below. Listen, a lot of effort goes into making these videos. And to be honest with you, the only way that we can continue to put out good, consistent content out there is with your feedback. So hit me up down below. Perhaps you have a question that I haven't answered, or perhaps you do have a question that I've already answered, and I will reply to you and send you a link to a video that was previously made answering your question, or make an entirely new video to help you out. So please subscribe, guys. So listen, this handbook is filled with content. I mean, it really is. Let's look at the amount of pages that it contains. 111 pages. We see that here. And just a number of different subjects. So what we're going to do, if I cover them all in one video, this video will turn into a marathon. So we don't want to do that. So as you see here, what we're going to do is we're going to cover subject by subject. And there will be a series of videos based on just this handbook alone. Welcome back. So on this video, we're going to cover when the rent is due. Many tenants, inquire as to when exactly the rent is due. And then there's a large misconception with grace periods. For example, let's say you have a rental agreement that states that rent is due on the first, on or before the first of each month. However, you have a 5-day grace period. Sometimes tenants approach their property manager on the 6th, and they ask for the property manager to waive a late fee. The claim under that request is that they are only, or that tenant is only 1 day late on their rent because it's only the 6th of the month, and they had a 5-day grace period. So the misconception is with the 5-day grace period. You see, the rent is due on one specific date, and that is on the 1st of the month. Based on this example, the rent is due on the 1st of the month. So therefore, if a tenant approaches a landlord on the 6th, and that tenant's claim is that the rent is only 1 day late because, for example, under this example, today is the 6th, and my rent was due yesterday. It was due up until yesterday, because yesterday was the 5th. Well, in essence, that belief is entirely wrong, because if a tenant is approaching a landlord on the 6th, then in essence, that tenant is 5 days late on their rent, because rent is due on the 1st. And however, there is a grace period where a tenant is allowed to pay late beyond the due date without incurring any type of late fees. The reason that rule was established was mainly to take into account back in the days when tenants had very few options to pay their rent. For example, walk into a leasing office that is usually open a limited amount of time. For example, Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning to 5 p.m. and most of the tenants were, used to work during the day. Nowadays, folks work around the clock, right? But nevertheless, the leasing office is usually open during what's considered, I suppose, normal business hours, right? Which are usually from 8 in the morning till about 5 p.m. or 9 to 6. But in any event, if you have a daytime job and you're scheduled to be at work between the equal hours of 8 to 5 or 9 to 6, then that just made it nearly impossible for you to be able to come in on rent day, walk into the office, and pay your rent. And one of the other options that was established was either a drop off slot, but then again, if you dropped off your rent overnight on after the first, and your payment wasn't going to be received until the following day, which is the second, which would automatically make your rent payment late because you arrived after the leasing office closed. And then a third option was to mail in your rent. Now, while the recommendation is, if you're going to mail in your rent, to mail it in ahead of time so that you anticipate the delays in the mailing process, and so that your rent arrives in a timely fashion. At that point, the tenant would be required to more or less mail it in ahead of time. However, if you're making your rent payment ahead of time in anticipation for it to arrive on time, then essentially you're paying your rent early because your rent isn't due. Your rent's not due until the first. But in order for you not to incur a late fee if there wasn't a grace period, then you'd have to send in your rent payment on or about the 27th, 28th of the prior month for the following month. So a rule was established that landlords were required to give some sort of a grace period. And the standard grace period it's about 5 business days. Now, there are some locations that offer a 3-day grace period, but all of that is negotiated and stipulated in your rental agreement. Nevertheless, the grace period is a period that was established in consideration for those that would mail in their rent payment. But, we have to treat everybody the same, because otherwise at that point, when we give certain people special treatment, in essence, that creates a liability for discrimination. So a grace period is afforded to everyone. Whether or not they need it, it's afforded to everyone. And like I mentioned previously, the grace period is usually 5 days. But it's negotiated. It can be anything that's negotiated under the rental agreement. It can be 3 days. It can be 4 days. It can be 5, 6, or 7. It's really up to. It's just a mutual agreement. But for the most part, the standard practice is 5 days. So let's go ahead and proceed. So now let's go over what this handbook tells us. So it says, paying your rent. When is rent due? Most rental agreements and leases require that rent be paid at the beginning of each rental period. Now, the reason why this is written that way is because there are locations, not very many though, but there are places that rent on a week-by-week or, bi-weekly or bi-monthly period. Interesting enough, and I'm not referring to hotels or motels. Because motels usually and hotels go by the day. But in any event, so let's go over this again. And what it says on here, and let me use red ink. What it says on here is, most rental agreements and leases require that the rent be paid at the beginning of each period. Of each rental period. And let me redo that one because I just crossed it off, and I want you guys to be able to read this very well. So let me just redo that one underline, and we're redoing it once again. There it is. That looks a lot better. All right. So let's stop right here for now. But let's go over to the CAR form. And CAR stands for, the acronyms CAR stand for California Association of Realtors, and licensed realtors have a form that. Well, I'm a licensed broker, right? So we have a form that we must use And it's well, I mean, it's the most recommended form, if you will, because I mean, we can actually use our own, but the car form is very detailed, and the car form, it just, it was drafted. The car lease agreement was drafted by legal professionals on behalf of the California Association of Realtors. So these guys have taken into account, what language is required to protect both the landlords, the realtor or property manager, if you will, and the tenants. So the language that's on those forms is just it's a language that is meant to protect and not infringe on anyone's rights. So let's go over and visit that form now. Give me 1 second. I have that right here, and I have a sample lease agreement. So I have a sample lease agreement, and the reason I decided to do this is for two reasons. I have to protect the privacy of my clients, so I can't use any real information, but the document is real. So the document we're reviewing here is the actual car form, the actual car month-to-month rental agreement, or actually residential or month-to-month rental agreement. So let's go and review what they tell us about, when the rent is due. And we're going to review one other document after this, but let's do one at a time. So this one tells us, and we're going to use our highlight. Let's reduce the size a little bit here. We're going to use our highlight, and this tells us rent is payable in advance on the 1st. Now, keep in mind that the due date can be negotiated. You see, the due date can be any date. The due date can be the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, the 18th, the 20th, the 23rd, whatever you negotiate with your landlord. Now, the standard practice is that your rent's going to be due on the 1st. That's just pretty much standard across the board, but it's not a law. It's not a statute. So, it's not written in stone. However, and it is negotiable. However, the standard practice is that your rent's going to be due on the 1st. And we saw that in the other handbook. But the car form, the car form does allow an option, and I'm going to circle it right here. It allows an option to fill in any date. You see, we can, the landlord and the tenant can agree that the rent is due on the 12th of each month. All right. So, but just based on the standard language that's on this document, it says on here, rent is payable in advance on the 1st. And then it goes on to say, well, I didn't like that highlight. Let's redo that highlight. That underline, I apologize. Then it goes on to say, and is delinquent on the next day. So rent is due on the 1st and delinquent on the next day. Because that is true. Although you have a grace period, and we're going to touch on that. Although you have a grace period, your rent can only be due on a specific date. Whatever that negotiated date is, whether it's the 1st, the 5th, the 3rd, I'm going backwards there, but whether it's the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, the 18th, the 20th, the 25th, whatever date you negotiated, rent is usually due on that specific date. Because it can't be due on a specific group period, for example. Your rent isn't going to be due from the 1st through the 5th. Your rent is due on the negotiated date that is due. And like I mentioned previously, the standard practice is that your rent is going to be due on the 1st. And it is late the following day. Or in essence, if you really want to get technical, it is late at 12:01 a.m. on the 2nd, based on this example right here. However, this does go on to say that there is a grace period. Okay, so we are still on the car lease agreement, and that is, again, the acronyms CAR stand for California Association of Realtors. So let's go ahead and review this, and I want to show you guys what it says about the grace period. And it says on here, if any installment of the rent due from the tenant is not received by, or by the landlord within, and again, the standard is 5 days. However, that's negotiable. I mentioned earlier that some lease agreements state in their language that there is only a 3-day grace period. There may very well be a 4-day grace period. Just like a landlord is more than welcome to offer you a 7 or 10-day grace period. At the end of the day, look, all of this stuff is negotiated, but the standard practice is 5 days. So I wanted to show it to you right here, and now we're going to go back to the tenant landlord handbook. So now that we're back at the State of California tenant landlord handbook, it says on here, let me highlight, it says, however, your lease agreement can specify any day of the month as the day rent is due. So see, let's go back to the let's go back to the cover page of this handbook, because I really want you guys to understand your rights, and I want you to understand the the documents that I'm sharing with you. Again, I don't want anyone to dispute over, Mark, you're just making this stuff out of thin air, and I want to make sure you understand your rights and where we're getting this information. So here we go. Again, as you noticed in the intro, this is the State of California Department of Consumer Affairs Tenant Landlord Handbook. Okay? So the State of California drafted this handbook. They put it together. And it's based on California legislature. So give me 1 second. Let's go back to where we were. Here we go. And we're back to the rent due date, right? So it says on here, let's go back to the last sentence that we read here. And it says, however, your lease or rental agreement can specify any day of the month as the due date. Okay, as the rent, any day of the month that the rent is due. So let me highlight that. It can be any date. So I think by now we've already established that. And the same goes for the grace period. The handbook goes on to say, it's very important for you to pay your rent on the day it's due. It's very clear on here, and I'm going to highlight it for you. It's very important for you to pay your rent on the day it's due. Why? Because as a tenant, one of your obligations under the rental agreement, because you have several, but the topic that we're covering here is rent, and when the due date of the rent is, or when your rent is due. So that's the topic we're covering. And although you have numerous obligations or responsibilities, as the landlord has obligations and responsibilities under the bilateral rental agreement, we are only covering rent right now. So that's the only topic I'm going to cover. But one of your primary responsibilities above all the other ones as a tenant is for you to pay your rent on time. And the landlord's ultimate responsibility under the rental agreement is habitability. So we're going to read that paragraph once again, and it says, it's very important for you to pay your rent on the day it is due. And then it goes on to say, not paying on time might lead to a negative entry on your credit report. And this is a true statement, because many times tenants pay late. And even if you pay within the grace period, your credit report might be impacted. Now, I will be the first to tell you that, as long as you pay within your grace period, to be honest with you, you're okay. About the only time that we're going to report to the credit bureaus that you've made a late rent payment is once we go beyond that grace period. And once a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit the lease agreement, or in other words, just the basic term of that notice is a 3-day notice to pay or quit. once that notice has been served upon the tenant. Because at that point, the tenant has, in essence, defaulted on rent. They defaulted on, they're in breach of the contract. And although the law requires the landlord to take additional steps prior to initiating an eviction or filing an unlawful detainer, and one of those requirements is, to notify the tenant that they are late. But the tenant already knows they're late. But, the law is the law, legislation is legislation. It is what it is. We're not going to, sit here and argue over something that we can't change. But a landlord must serve the delinquent tenant a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. However, our firm doesn't normally report late payments until we reach that point. So you usually have a grace period. So I hope this video was very helpful to you. This was a short one. This was a short topic. And there's just so many topics that we have to cover under this handbook. And I'm going to continue to make videos. So keep an eye out, or, look for the next video. And if there's anything that I haven't covered, or any inquiry, concern, or a video that you just might like me to cover, hit me up on the comments down below. I check every one of those comments and I reply to those comments. Send your requests and your criticism. All is welcome. I thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.